and welcome back to Adobe Live on a Monday morning or Monday afternoon, depends on where you're joining us from. My name is Tim and I'm joined by my best friend, Joe Allam, on my left.
Good,
Screen
good
right,
positioning there.
left.
I would have definitely gone to the... Oh, I did it right as well. There we go.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
It's
There
just
we go.
like we planned it before.
This is chuckle vision about to happen here. What's going on?
Oh dear. And of course, welcome everybody who's joining us in the chat. The chat is, as always, on Behance. So be.net/Adobe Live. Come on over so we can read the chat because we can only focus on one chat at once. So make sure to come to behance.net/Adobe Live. Say hi in the chat. And of course, to those people who are already there, including Jackie and Madeline and Oliver and Sean and John and Steve from New Zealand and everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you are in the world. Joe, what would you like to talk about today? We have a fantastic hour for you all at home. Joe, let us know what would you like to show today?
Well, seeing as we are one day towards December, we are getting prime into the Northern Hemisphere winter. So I've got some winter images. Unfortunately, for obvious reasons, I haven't really traveled this year, but I've got some winter images from last year and I believe even the year before. No, these are all 2019 that I can share and go through some editing processes. I think what may also be interesting is showing a couple of images that have already been edited and show the breakdown of how it was kind of built up. When it comes to winter images, there's a few sort of things to take into account, both when you're taking the images and when you're editing them. Probably most notable scene for a typical sort of winter shot is going to be something like snow or frost. Generally speaking, you're going to be getting a lot of snow and just white things in an image. So I guess, yeah, from the get-go, when you're actually taking winter photos, one of the things that I actually do quite frequently is I stop my camera down with the exposure meter. So generally I shoot with an auto ISO and then I'll use a fixed aperture that I set on the go as I'm going about my day. And an auto shutter speed. But if you do that in general settings, especially in a snowy scene, so frequently the snow is going to be completely blown out. It's going to look super
just
white.
Just like my face right now because the sun is coming out back again. Like, ooh, let's do a winter stream. It's nice and cold outside. Nope.
Yep, there we go, sunny. On point.
But at least I do have my winter waffles ready so I can snack on them and have a warm sweater and some nice warm water. So I'm all ready. I hope you're also ready at home. Perhaps a nice hot cup of tea and bring in the winter spirit. Hopefully,
you could get some After Effects like steam just coming up and maybe some sound effects of like crackling wood in the background. And
well, we will have the fireside chats. I think the first one is starting this Thursday, I believe. So that's interesting. But yeah, some smoke perhaps. Maybe I can find some assets on Adobe stock. Who knows?
There's actually a YouTube channel that's dedicated to just jazz music. Well, I mean, there's multiple that are dedicated to this, but there's one that Ellie puts on a lot that's just a cafe, and it's just got this sort of calm jazz music, but they've jazzed it all up for winter at the moment, and it's all like
so can you hear people talking in the background and some
you just put it on the TV and just let it run, and it's
just to bring back the 2019 vibes.
Yeah,
of people actually talking. But anyway, right, well then I suppose we can just hop on over to your screen and then we can take a look at the first couple of photos.
Okay, so I've got a number of images here. There's some from Japan, some from America. Just Japan and America in these shots. So starting off with Japan, this was, if you know my YouTube channel, you know of the Japan Rail series that I did, which was a 4-part sort of video series of traveling from the north of Japan down through to central Japan in the winter by train and capturing images along the way. So first stop on the trip was Sapporo in the North Island, Hokkaido, and it was just covered in snow. They get some pretty thick, fluffy snow there everywhere. It's absolutely beautiful. But also it was kind of like a real test for setting the camera exposure, because although winter we think of as quite dark, when it's snowy, it actually makes everything really bright. Sometimes the light is just reflecting off of everything, and you just get all sorts of light and refraction of just everything everywhere because of that sort of like whiteness. And sometimes your images end up looking black and white, or a scene just looks black and white in total. And just to show some other examples, so this is another area. This was about a week later. Again, super heavy snow, but you can see immediately where I've underexposed the image just because of how bright this is. So if we look into our histogram, over on the right side on the highlights, we've got this whole area here, which is where all your bright spots would be, and I've stopped it down. So we are shooting at 1/850th of a second, ISO 400 and f5.6. In a normal scenario, I would probably shoot this like 2/50th of a second, but what would happen, and I can simulate that if I bring up the exposure, is if this was exposed correctly, like I'm looking into the shadows and everything, look at what happens in the highlights. Everything is just white.
Oh yeah,
and can't see any of that detail in the snow.
Just like the window behind me.
The first step to winter photography, I find anyway, especially if it's got snow, is just to underexpose it. And you can see if we drop that back to how I originally exposed the shot. If we zoom in further, you can just see that sort of texture in the snow, just ever so slight bits of shadow. And that really helps preserve it so that when you come to edit it, you're going to have that available.
And you would think that just even those small differences and textures wouldn't make much of a difference, but it's just, it adds some fluffiness to the snow.
Yes,
otherwise
definitely.
It just would be pure white,
yeah,
like a blank Photoshop document.
Yeah, definitely. And to take another example, this is where I'm saying about how sometimes a scene can just look black and white, straight out of camera, just by the nature of things being white. And these trees in particular, I'm not sure what type of tree they are, but they have a very dark leaf. So this is straight out of camera. But as I edited it, I went through and I sort of accentuated a lot of the blue tones and just sort of shifted things to my own version of the sort of monochromatic look.
Super nice. That's gorgeous. And Sean is asking in the chat, does Joe spot meter the snow? Do you spot that?
Yes, sometimes. I must admit, though, I'm sometimes working fast, like too fast to be able to just stop and spot meter on stuff. So quite often my positioning on the camera using the little joystick on the back is for mostly focus. And I have my settings, because I'm shooting on Fuji, I can so easily just change my aperture quickly and whatever. So I do quite often leave the settings in like a manual sort of format and lock the exposure. I guess it's hard to explain, but in principle, yes, I do spot meter the snow, but it may be a case of I will half press down on the snow, lock my exposure, and then go up and then half press again, and that does my focus.
Gotcha.
So you can kind of get the two in one, if that makes sense.
And Sean says, thanks.
And sometimes as well, I will even use an ND filter. So for video in particular, that is super useful.
Have you
that way?
Have you ever used one of these gradiated filters where they have a darker part at the top and a lighter part at the bottom, and the gradient going from dark to light?
When I first started getting into photography, back in 2006, one of the first accessories I bought off the recommendation of a friend who was also kind of getting involved. We were just encouraging each other to spend money, I guess. Was a set of filters that included a lot of gradient filters. And at the time, I was 15, so I wasn't exactly spending huge amounts. And the filter set I got, looking back, was probably less than £50 for maybe 10, 15 filters. So the quality wasn't really that good. And I think that just forever put me off those types of filters. I could probably look into it again, but I found that they introduced a lot of like purple hue and color shift. Not only that, but depending on the scene that you're taking, so often there's a hill or a mountain or a building in the way, and they haven't designed the filters that, you know, there isn't a Matterhorn filter, for example.
You have to manually etch it, like, okay, here we go.
Yeah. So,
but I suppose it's more like if you want to be purely in analog photography, then you basically have to use one of these gradient filters. But if you have the power of Photoshop and Lightroom, why bother?
Yeah. These days, the dynamic range on cameras is ridiculous. It's actually hilarious just how much detail you can bring back sometimes. And for a while, I was actually shooting with a Sony A7R II, and I found it affected my editing because sometimes I had too much flexibility.
Oh no!
I could pull the highlights around everywhere, the shadows up and down. And looking back over some of my edits during that time, and I just really don't like them. And granted, a lot of the time when I look back over my edits, I don't like them. But the Sony ones in particular, I think I just didn't really check myself. And sometimes I was going too harsh on the sort of recovery of things.
So because you thought, oh, I just fix it in post, right?
I don't think it was even that mentality at the time of shooting. Really? It was more a case of afterwards. It was like, well, I can, so I am.
Oh, okay. And fair enough.
Yeah, I notice it with other people as well, particularly Sony's. I think it's just because the sensor quality is so good that it just gives you no restrictions. And as someone in my own work, I'd always recognize that I like working to restrictions. So I think in some ways working with a less superior, if you'd call it that, camera may actually benefit. I don't know. It's maybe more of a mental block than it is a digital one. But anyway.
Right, back to the winter photography. And I think I let down the blinds a bit because I'm way too overexposed.
The other thing that happens quite a lot in winter is you get one of two things: either a extremely crisp and clear sky, or you can get like a misty haze of things. So this, of course, is Mount Fuji in Japan, and this mountain for a long time I felt was almost mythical because of the many times I'd been to Japan. This was actually the first time I'd ever actually seen the mountain up close. Passing it on trains, it was always covered by the haze. You could never see it. So being able to see it in all its grand perspective, granted it's still hazy here, was pretty majestic, but we can correct it in our edits. So as I went through, and this was the edit I did. So yeah, these are just some examples of types of images, and I will choose a couple, maybe 3 or so that I can get through and edit. I think I might start with this one, which the previous edit I did ended up looking like this, so a completely stark difference. But in my eyes, it's kind of a bit more commercial looking.
Will you work on that today?
Yes. So this one I think is a good one to work on. We've got some harsh light to work with, some bright snow but underexposed, shadows and all sorts, and then some fun with the sun. And then possibly another one that might be interesting is this image from New York. And my original edit ended up looking like this. So perhaps we can try and recreate that as well. Right. So let's start with this.
Yes.
So I should point out this being a 2019 image is actually referencing off of my server. I realized that just as we started the stream. So if it goes a little bit slow, that is why, but I think we are good. So I'm going to create a virtual copy first of all, so that I've always got my original in the library. So that is command and apostrophe. And then I'll try and just run you through as I'm editing and the types of things that I'm working on. So as I said, this is shot in Fujifilm, so I've got all the Fujifilm profiles. I pretty much always use classic Chrome, but ones that may suit for snow are some of the Pro Negative ones. So you can see that's just added a little bit of a blue hue. That one's just a little bit flatter if we toggle before and after. But I'm going to leave on classic Chrome because I like that little bit of contrast that it applies. If we compare that to, say, Adobe Color, this is how Lightroom interprets the image versus classic Chrome. And I'm just wondering actually if Zoom is even showing these nuances across on the stream.
Yeah, I totally agree. The other one, yeah. Yeah, even the stream is compressing the colors a bit. So if it doesn't come across super clear at home, that might be the reason why. Because we're streaming it.
So, okay, so this is obviously a raw image. When you're shooting winter and snow, shooting raw is very, very handy, more so than any other scene, I would say, because we've got these areas of harsh, bright light coming through the trees, and then we've got things that are normally bright but are actually being exposed darker because they're in the shade. It's incredibly tricky. So if I show how the exposure can increase on this raw file, you can see what we can work with. It's not necessarily what we should work with. So I'm actually going to ignore this area in the bottom left originally, and I'm going to work on the image as if I'm dealing with this, and I'll come back and arrange some exposure area for the bottom corner.
That's great because our camera is over that part anyway. So
yeah. So I'm going to increase the exposure ever so slightly, and increase the highlights, and then just bring back some of the shadows. Sorry, opposite world there. Bring back the highlights, increase the shadows. And if I play around with the exposure, the contrast. So usually I would add a little bit of contrast, but I'm not going to go too much on this because I'm going to be doing most of that with the tone curve. Just play around with some of the whites and blacks a little bit. And I find that the clarity can really help, especially on some of these details in the minute shadow of the snow. But let's go into our tone curve, and I always start with the middle and just play around, just pulling it up and down to see which sort of direction I want to go, and then I'll work from the middle of the next section. So I'm going to go for the shadows here and just bring that down a little bit. So I'm looking for something that's quite punchy, because obviously this is a bright white car, and if we imagined that this was like a promo shot for this particular cabin, in the case of when I originally took this image, it was as we were leaving this cabin that we'd stayed in, and I wanted to possibly get a blog image that would work for just documenting where it was that we stayed. Believe it or not, this was taken in, I think, the end of March. Middle of March.
Wow.
And we were very surprised to see snow. So we left that morning in what was it called? Trinidad in California.
Mm.
Is it Trinidad? It's a name of a place that is the same as the island. I think it's Trinidad, which was warm and California weather, and then coming up through into Oregon and went through some desert, in fact, which again looked very dry and warm. And as we started getting higher and higher, we reached snow, and we were completely unprepared for this. It was quite the shock. So yeah, this was 1 or 2 days of snow on a trip that was otherwise quite warm. Okay, so I'm just, again, tweaking these mids areas, and I'm also ignoring this sun area. So I know that that is very blown out at the moment and there. So I'm just looking overall at the trees and the sort of mid-ground. And
well, I can't wait to see how you bring that burst of warmth into the sun that you had in the final edit.
So we've gone for a little bit of an S-curve with a slight highlight bend. Oh, that's weird.
Perfect.
Oh, what's going on there? Come on. Yeah. Okay. And I will probably go into my color curves here. And where we've got this this white area, it's being found to be quite blue. I'm not sure if I want that so much in this image. So I'm actually going to just bring it back just a little bit so it's warming up. If we toggle between, we should be able to see the original was quite dark and blue. In the edit, we're adding in a little bit of warmth.
So much better. And then in the chat they're asking, is this Mount Hood or Crater Lake?
Almost. Almost. If you want to keep guessing, it's near to Crater Lake. It's actually a place called Rocky Point, which I believe is very similar to Crater Lake. Which, if I understand rightly, Crater Lake is a volcanic crater that is formed a lake on top. I'm assuming it's dormant or it's not an active volcano.
And obviously it has an island called Wizard Island.
That sounds
Crater Lake.
Okay, let's go into saturation. So again, I'm going to click onto this point. I'm just going to desaturate some of these blues. And you see that's actually making a huge difference there. So if I drag it all the way down, that really removes some of that saturation. And by removing that blue, it's in turn warming the image. And if I went the opposite way, that's a little bit overdone. But interestingly, going quite drastic in the desaturation doesn't create as uncomfortable an image as it does going the opposite direction. And likewise, the luminance. So I can click into this area and I could drop down some of those blue hues just to add an extra bit of contrast in this direction. There are multiple ways you can push and pull your image. Going through, I'm going to skip over the color grading for the moment. Sharpening and everything, that's all good. I'm not going to touch that for now because that may slow down the process. Profile corrections and transform. So this, I'm going to just test the auto one just to see how it fixes this building. Looks like it did all right, but I'm going to do a manual one because I always feel safer when I do a manual one. So I'm just going to drag here. So I'm just going to correct the vertical guides and things. Now, I don't have a reference point to do this front one, but judging by my eye, I'm going to say it's about there. And that one, because that angled building is angled away from me, it's about there. Okay, so that should be the perspective corrected ever so slightly. If we look at the original and then back, things should be upright and working well. You could add grain into your image. Again, this can help with some of the detail of the snowy sort of areas. I'd find that if I was adding grain, I would actually add it at a very small size. And you may not even notice it too much, but you'll definitely see it, just a little bit of texture, I imagine, around some of these highlight burns.
You can actually fake some texture and sharpness where there wasn't any in the first place.
Yeah. And I'm just going to pull around with the calibration a little bit. So what I can do is if I adjust the red hues slightly, and then I'll adjust the blues back. You notice if I go all the way over here, it creates this sort of greeny tinge. We don't want that too much, but if we play with the green slightly, we can work towards just a little bit of color contrast, and you're sort of separating things away on the color wheel of things. You're spreading it slightly and twisting it. Right. Let's now head back up. So that's how I generally work on going through my edits, and then I'll go back and do multiple passes and just continue to finesse things a bit further. So now that I've gone through, I can now come back to my contrast slider. I've got my tone all set, and I can just tweak the black point. I can add in a bit of punch on things. And in fact, I'm going to raise up some of these. And now I can work on this sort of central area. So one of the little tricks that I do quite often is I'll add a radial filter, and I'll just draw it over the sun or a bright spot in an image. And I believe I need to invert this so that it affects what's inside the circle rather than everything outside. And I'll warm up quite a lot, actually. And I could blow out the highlights even further. I could raise them up.
So that's how I did that. All right.
Yeah. I can also drop down the shadows. And you see what that's doing here is where you've got these sort of streaks of light, by adding contrast there, it just makes the streaks a little bit more prominent. And you see how the difference is between dropping it back and raising it up. If I do it on the contrast slider, that's a little bit more drastic, but doing it with the shadows and highlights gives you a little bit more control. You can just raise the white. I'm happy for this to be completely blown out. It is the sun after all. It's not like it's another area of the image. We're used to seeing the sun blown out. Could you imagine the days when we're able to capture the sun in actual exposure? That would be crazy. And if I wanted, I could boost the saturation, but I think it's actually adding enough sort of natural saturation. I can tweak and move this. So if we turn that on and off, we see just how different that radial filter is making things. It really adds sort of like a central warmth to this image. And again, if we toggle back to the original and then the edit, I do that quite a lot. I toggle between things. And now if I was to work on this lower corner, I would bring in a gradient filter. I'm actually going to make this quite large because there is a roll off between what's dark and what's light. It's not actually that harsh a difference in light.
So are you going for a more, I don't know, even exposure over the entire image, or how can you do that without just removing any contrast, or are you darkening that now? What's like your plan?
So it would vary on the day-to-day. Sometimes I may want to make an image overall have like an overall scene, or there could be a visual interest of what narrative I'm trying to tell in a story, in which case I will darken areas that I feel don't really add to the narrative, or I can help draw the viewer in. So in the case of this image, I'm sort of looking to tell the story of, here is the hut, here's where you can stay. You obviously arrive by car, and this is the weather and the scenery you can expect.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of driving you into the hut. If I can rationalize what is a very standard picture. So the areas that I'm looking to not have distract the image would be this big mound here, and potentially some of the trees up here, although I do quite like the way the light is glowing off of these. So this mound in particular, where I've underexposed it in the first place to get the detail of some of this snow and other areas, I'm now actually going to make it darker again, so that I can just sort of hide it away. And we've brightened up this area for those brighter areas, and of course naturally that brings up this. So this is the lower left. I'm going to be hiding it away from the exposure, or rather the composition. So I can do that just a little bit with some dropping of the highlights and the shadows, and I could decrease the saturation slightly and potentially even color temperature this a little bit cooler, which would add some color contrast to that warm sun. So that is going further blue. In fact, I don't need to desaturate it that much. And
And of course, just cropping out that part wouldn't really work for this image because you would be cutting into the important parts of the image.
Yeah, so if I went into the crop tool, if I was to get rid of this altogether, I could do. I lose some of these details up here in the trees, which I think are actually quite a nice, interesting point. It puts the car quite uncomfortably close to the edge, so I probably want to have enough sort of breathing room to the side as I do below it, which then if we increase the crop again, before we know it, we're showing a lot of this already.
We're just right back where we started.
Yeah, so I will actually crop in just a little bit. I usually do my crops last. I like to do the whole edit overall, but for the sake of brevity, let's add that crop now. And just another aspect I'm going to do is another radial filter.
But that's interesting that you say I crop last, because I personally, the first thing I do is just crop the image, because if I don't see it in the end, why bother editing?
Interesting. I think from my perspective, I'm the type of person that even the things that are hidden, I like them to be complete. So, for example, underneath my desk is just as tidy as on top of the desk.
That's what would Joe do? Ask yourself.
Well, I'm the type of person who, if I built a chest of drawers, the back of it would be just as nice as the front.
That really sounds like you. That's amazing. I mean, I'm more like, if you don't see it, why should it be pretty? Who cares? Why should I spend work and time into something that wouldn't be seen anyway?
Yeah.
And that's why I have the perfect zoom angle for this camera. And outside of that zoom angle, you don't want to see that.
Okay, so I've just added here another radial filter, and this one is actually just focused on the car, so I'm just brightening up the car. So if we turn those off, you can see one's for the sun and one's just brightening for the car. I could do this with the brush if I wanted, but that would take a lot more time. So again, just for the sake of demonstration, that's how I would operate this one. And I think, again, I'm just going to brighten up the overall image just a little bit, so you've got a little bit more sort of punch on things. And just tweak it slightly. So yeah, you can see I've brightened it up 1.10. So that just counteracts the fact that I underexposed it by probably one stop, maybe 1.5 in camera. It's just rebalanced everything. So if we toggle from the original into what could be an edit, and I'll leave this one here so that we can move on to a different image. If we look at what I did last year when I edited it, it went even further. I'd say that's potentially a little too much for what I would want to do now.
Well, you can instantly picture that one in a travel magazine for nice ski resorts.
Yep, just a cover image of some sort. In fact, I think I use this as a thumbnail on the video, and one of the tips for doing thumbnails for things is because they always shrink down in size. Most people see them only in the search list or on the recommended feed. Is the smaller things get, the harder it is to see details. So saturation and contrast just help things stand out. So editing for a thumbnail, you quite often over edit. It feels dirty, but it
just add some red circles and big arrows.
Yeah, it just makes it stand out just a little bit. All right, let's move on to this image.
Briefly in the chat, they're still guessing where the place this image was, and they're now talking about the deepest lakes in the USA.
Oh,
this is interesting.
Yeah, I have a feeling that Rocky Point was in that list.
Interesting. But
yeah, it's a very interesting place. The road up to it, especially for the time of year that we went, I have been told, I mean, when I posted the video, by the time I got round to editing it, it was, I think, June or something. So it felt even more out of place that there was snow halfway through. But I actually had a comment on it recently that said that part of Oregon, you can see snow almost all year. But yeah, the road up to it and the sort of hour or so beforehand, you go from almost desert into this winter place. It's bizarre, very bizarre.
And there are some other questions in the chat. Lightroom or Lightroom Classic today? We're working with Lightroom Classic today. Any reason why you would like to work with Classic today instead of
so one of the main things, and this I guess is a feedback opportunity to Adobe, is the import control. I still prefer in Lightroom Classic. So not only where I'm storing the images, so locally or in the cloud, but I make the use of the import renamer when I'm going into Lightroom. So I rename, you can see in the bottom left here, I've got my file name is the reverse date, the camera that's used, and then a custom bit of text, which I set to country and then city code, and then the original file name. And that to me is hugely beneficial for multiple reasons. One, it just means that at a quick glance, if I need to remind myself of when was this image taken, rather than opening up the info, which again is just an eye on the keyboard or whatever, I have it in my file name. But also if ever I lose my files or they reconnect, or as in the case of today, I've got them positioned on my server. If I ever need to reconnect them, having that date in the file name makes it so easy to find them in the folder structure. And unfortunately, Lightroom CC, or at least I haven't found it, doesn't have that renaming capability because it manages things internally on its own.
Of course, Lightroom CC has a different approach to managing your files, and that's why it's a separate app. Otherwise, if Adobe was to create the exact same features, why bother building a new app? Wouldn't make really any sense. So Lightroom Classic for today.
One aspect that I do enjoy about it is the library syncing. So I think my Lightroom on my iPad is still connected to this 2019 library. I never actually got around to, because I create a different catalog for each year. So if I'm editing on the iPad, that is with the Lightroom CC app, and it then synchronizes back to Lightroom Classic, and that works really well. And I actually really enjoy editing on the iPad. I've done it on planes quite a lot, and with the right music playing, you can just really get into it and just jam away on a screen that has no distractions. It's just photo editing, and that works really well for me.
All right. Before we continue, just two things. One of them, make sure if you're joining the stream over on YouTube, come on over to behance.net/Adobe Live. That's where we are reading the chat and where you can ask questions. So make sure to come on over, because we do have a question. Hi guys, have been trying to open Adobe Lightroom, but it shuts down without opening. What might be the issue? Well, Caroline, the issue is we can't really diagnose your problem from here, so I would point you to the fine folks over at Adobe Support, and I'm sure they can help you out. Just give them a call and they will do their best. So yeah, sorry, we can't really support any troubleshooting here live, because we want to show some cool photos. Right, so back to the next one.
Yes, so this is an image from New York that is quite fun. So do you know what's really interesting about this is the Steam for New York is obviously very famous. It's quite a novelty for us when we're visiting. So like, Steam, it feels so magical in the street. And I remember the very first time I encountered a huge amount of Steam like this. You know, you're sort of running around and playing in it, and then you think, actually, is this sewage? Like, why is there steam? Is it coming up from the hot drains? But I looked into it, and it's not. In most of, I think it's in Lower Manhattan, steam is actually a utility. So buildings and companies actually pay for steam to be delivered to their building, and that provides their heating in the winter, and through some clever thermodynamics does their cooling in the summer. So steam is a bit like your electricity. It's just runs through these massive pipes everywhere. So yeah.
Also, sometimes you can see some liquid nitrogen tanks just sitting in the open, and they are pumping some nitrogen into the phone lines so they don't develop rust there. So sometimes you see some pretty interesting things in the streets of Manhattan.
Yeah, it's a busy place. There's a lot happening all at once.
So what's the first thing? After you took this picture, do you usually have a look at it again on the camera back display, or do you just don't look at the image again until you have loaded it on your computer? So what would be the first step?
So in this particular instance, so this road was actually closed for whatever reason. I'm not sure why. So we actually had a lot of time. You can see there's a police car up there. So it was pedestrians were able to just walk in and out. So we actually had time to just kind of play around getting some images in the Steam. And I was checking the camera a lot as we were shooting these and just seeing how they worked. But yeah, I don't usually come back and look at them in bulk until either after the trip or maybe on the flight home. Just because we're usually so busy on the amount of time that we're spending actually going out and shooting. And by the time you've eaten in the evening and then you import and then you realize, oh, it's 1 a.m. again and you're getting up for sunrise. And I generally don't get to look at the stuff until after, like way after, which is why it can take so long to edit things because of just doing trip back to back to back. So yeah, it's difficult to work with. In this instance, I'm actually going to start with one of my presets. So I created a load of presets that work for various different scenarios. And this just helps with consistency on things, and it just gets you to a starting point. So I'm actually going to go for this Darkstone contrast one, and I can show you what that's added. So it's added all sorts of tweaks to things with some of the highlight shadows. Pretty much every element here has had some adjustments, and I've been tweaking and working on these for a number of years, to the point that I've now got a set that works well for the scenes that I like, and I've got enough flexibility. And it just really helps when you see your images as a whole, especially if you're posting somewhere. So these are kind of all the adjustments that have been made, but I'm going to go and do the transform. So I can see that this right-hand side just needs tweaking a little bit. So I'm going to adjust the vertical just to make sure that that's all good and vertical.
In the chat, they're just pointing out the one traffic cone on top of the car on the right.
Yeah, I love this. I feel like that's been done from either the night before.
Just the classic part of not my job.
Yeah. Or the cone has to go down, but there's a car in the way. Okay, so I'm just going to tweak this a little bit further, raise the exposure slightly. Again, I'm ignoring some of the steam because there's quite a lot happening there. I'm just looking mainly at this sort of area. So the idea or the vision I have is to brighten up this, but I want the asphalt to be quite dark. So I may come back and add in some black point, or in fact, that's doing quite a good job here. Again, I'm aware that this bag is losing a lot of detail, so I'm going to come and retouch that. And the highlights are a tricky one because this sky it was overcast on the day anyway, and it's close to being fully blown out. Sometimes that just happens and you just have to accept it and roll with it. And just tweak the clarity a little bit. The vibrance from this particular preset is maybe a little bit too strong, so I'm just going to drop that back. And now I'm going to go into some local adjustments. So in fact, I'm going to do this one with the brush rather than the radial. So I'm just going to increase the brush slightly. My feather is fully at 100%, so it's not going to be a harsh sort of line. I'm just going to brush in on Ellie's bag here. And yeah, you can't really see too much is happening because there is no control in place just yet. But if I hover over, you can see that I've just painted that area. And I'm going to increase the exposure slightly, but it's mainly, I think, the shadows. If I go fully, you can see that just brings back some of that bag detail. And if I drop the contrast, that should show more of the detail as we lift it up and some of the white point. So yeah, if I turn that on and off, that was how it was when we worked on it overall. But doing this just helps bring back some of the focus in that point, because this really is the sort of focal element of the image. And it's also a little bit warm, so I'm just going to cool that down. And in fact, I'm going to cool down the overall image. So this was as shot in the camera, but I think it looks a little bit cooler, pun not intended, if we make it overall a cooler image. And again, bring up some of that exposure. And yeah,
I mean, the image overall is, of course, really, really cool. And I don't want to see that vape pen that produced that cloud.
I'm actually just going to do a little bit of a crop. So I'm going to crop out that awkward bit there.
Oh, crop.
I don't want to go too high because I quite like this corner. I think it's just interesting. It's this type of scene that you sort of look in, and then as you look around, you see more detail, and you start to see things like the cone hat, the police in the background, and whatever. But yeah, this is quite a fun sort of image. And again, from the winter aspect, the thing that always seems to happen is just having to work with very bright white areas and dark areas. That seems to be the common sort of thread on things. But yeah, I think this works quite cool. And what I would potentially do if I'm editing a huge batch of images is I would do Command-Shift-C, which brings up my copy settings. And I have almost everything set to copy except for the brush. Sometimes I toggle the filters on and off. Noise controls, transform, they're usually unique to a particular image. And so is crop, so I have those untoggled. And this will copy the develop settings. I realize I forgot to do a virtual copy to start with, but never mind. And then if I go to another image, so this was about 20 minutes later when they started letting traffic through. So I create a virtual copy. And now if I do Command-Shift-V, that will just paste those settings. And I do this a lot when I'm editing big batches of images, because sometimes I can't actually decide which image is sort of my hero shot for that particular moment until I've edited them. I sort of need to see that finished one, because you can find little details that come out in the edit and you realize, oh, that was something that really makes this image. Just like with the car image before, adding that sunburst of warmth really added so much more that I wouldn't have seen in the library from the original shot. So I do paste my settings a lot between images, and it allows me to work faster and get more edits out of it. So I can just paste this on, tweak it slightly. You can see the exposure is just a little bit brighter on here. And again, I can just cool it down. And I'm also going to go into my luminance, and I'm going to click on the asphalt here and just drag that back down. In fact, I'm actually going to put a gradient filter and drop the exposure just for that road. I like it when it's just a very dark, contrasty road. It's I don't know, makes it feel more velvety. If a road can be described as velvety.
Yeah, as long as your face is not dragging on the asphalt, and it's very velvety. But I've briefly seen the new, the new color grading circles at the bottom. Have you worked with them?
I haven't actually tested them a great amount.
So they're so good, because now you can also edit the midtones.
Midtones, yeah. So what I do like actually is that this is obviously come from the
video side from Premiere.
Yeah, what was it called before in Lightroom?
No.
The tone?
Oh, split toning.
Split toning, that was it. Yeah, so where I've saved these in presets, the shadows and highlights are still active, but now I do have that mid one. So if I wanted to adjust the mid, so I guess that would be some areas around here and potentially this part of the building. We can have a play around with it now, and we can see what we'd want to work with. I'd probably go more towards the blue again, maybe a little bit bluey greeny, so it's not too warm. And I can drop that back or raise it up. So yeah, that's just.
And Sean in the chat Last time in New York City, a crane crashed down and smashed 2 blocks of parked cars. Great photos!
Oh, wow.
What a twist in the story.
Adding in the crop again. I feel like we got some crop fans in the chat. See, again, this is the game of cropping. It's I want to crop out or do something with this area. It's a little bit distracting, but at the same time, I do like this tube here. So it's, you know, pick one. I also like this cone here. In fact, I don't think there's a huge amount I can deal with. I'm just going to crop out that awkward bit there.
But watch out for those tangents.
There we go. And yeah, so that's a kind of a brief look over things, and shows, I guess, how I would copy edits from one, paste onto another. And I do that frequently, and I could even see what would happen if I copied these settings and then pasted them onto an image of a completely different scene, and just see what happens. It's completely wrong, but that could just
Welcome to the Matrix.
Could just be the white balance.
There you go.
A bit tweaking. It doesn't take too long to get back to a starting point, because for the most part, a lot of the images use very similar editing sort of techniques in terms of your sharpness, your grain, and all sorts, depending on the style that you like. So you can just run through a whole batch, copying and pasting, and see how that goes. I probably wouldn't do it on this image though. I'm not a fan of that. So yeah, that's I guess a sort of run through. If we've got time,
we have about 8 minutes. And also, very funny, Sandrine is saying creative cropping. Yeah, that's actually what the CC stands for. It's creative cropping. And I have a question. So you mostly stay in Lightroom for these photos. Do you ever feel the need to hop on over to Photoshop for any of those images?
Very, very rarely. I actually got on board with Lightroom fairly late, it seemed, in terms of how like Lightroom had developed. I think I joined when Lightroom was at version 5, maybe. Previous to that, I used to edit everything in Photoshop, and I would use I actually used to edit a lot with gradient maps and various adjustment layers, and I would save them out as PSDs, and I would organize my images elsewhere. And yeah, it was file management I had it down, but it was convoluted. And going into Lightroom and creating presets really just streamlined the whole process. And I found that when I switched to Lightroom, I actually edited so much more. So rather than coming away from a year and I had maybe 100, 200 edits from the whole year, I would come away with maybe 2,000 edits and multiple hundreds from a single trip. It gave me so much more flexibility to see similar images, but with the same edits applied, just by copying and pasting. But yeah, in terms of like manipulation and stuff, I don't really do a great amount. I guess the healing tool, I find works a little bit better in Photoshop still. I'm just going to get out those dust points because they're staring at me.
And by the way, if you want to know more about how Joe organizes the photos and everything, the files, make sure to watch the What Would Joe Do streams. I think we have 2 streams where you exclusively talk about organization and keeping your files clean and tidy.
Yes, it was. We were dusting down the internals.
That was a while ago.
It was.
Ages ago. But anyway, all right. We have about 5 minutes to 6 minutes. So what are your last?
So I'm just going to go through a speed run of this.
Photoshop speed run. No, Lightroom speed run.
Let's see how that goes. So I'm just going to kind of warm it up, twist and pull with the shadow and highlights. This particular image was taken on my GH5. It's one of the only times I've ever used it for photography, because I was skiing at the time and I could only physically carry one camera. And I trusted that the GH5 would do well for the stabilization, and also the weather sealing, because it's built like a tank. So I think this was around minus 18, maybe minus 15 degrees. So I was freezing my fingers off trying to play around with the settings. But it's an image that I think came out quite well. I'm pretty happy with this. Generally happy with any camera that I've got in my hands, to be honest. I mean, that's like
that
clicking.
Sky. That's gorgeous. All the smooth and pastel colors.
Yeah, I remember one of the frustrating things about this particular image is there were the rangers coming up behind on their schema bills, and the resorts. I guess this happens all over the world unless you've got a floodlit ski run. They will close down at sunset because you don't want to get lost on the mountain. And I was the last person up there, obviously, with my camera, and they're just sort of slowly like pushing me, but being very, very polite and Japanese about it, and just saying like keep going, please, keep going. And I'm just stopping every meter or so because I'm like, but the sky, look at it. Yeah, it was just, it just popped off. It looked amazing. So
can't imagine how it must have looked in real life. Yeah,
it was one of those moments where you could feel it, and I just didn't know where to look and capture, and obviously being pushed off of or down the mountain, it was like endlessly frustrating, but at the same time I'm glad that I did manage to get something from it. So I'm actually just going to do some noise reduction on here, because the GH5 can be quite noisy at times. I say at times, pretty much all times. Does it have, I'm not sure if it has a profile installed, but
and now we take the dehaze slider and crank it to the max, right?
That could be an interesting thing. We can see what happens. Because just a little bit, actually, it's bringing in some of that detail.
You could just dehaze the sky.
Yep, I could do. Oh,
you don't have to. I don't want to be the hovering art director here.
No, these are good tips. They're reminding me of tools. I think I've only ever really used the dehaze tool frequently on my Hong Kong images, because there's that haze that comes over.
And of course, you can always
unquestionable haze.
You can always add haze with a dehaze slider if you drag it to the left. Yep,
that's very true. And yeah, that's adding.
Or
a good little tip there.
Go to Photoshop and use one of the new neural filters, and one of them is depth-aware haze. You can actually pick and choose how warm or cold you would like to have it, and how much color it should pick up.
I was unaware of that one.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite interesting.
Okay, you should watch the Max keynote, perhaps, with Conan O'Brien.
I saw it, I don't know how I've missed the depth-aware haze.
Perhaps they didn't talk about that. Maybe. But anyway.
It's probably not Conan's strong suit, is it?
You think? Can't imagine.
All right, so this is a pretty speedy run. I think that's done an all right job. So from the original, very flat in image, because again, I use the GH5 mainly for video. So this was in its video profile, and I quickly switched it to photo, and took it from there and edited.
What a transformation. Wow.
So yeah, I think that's a pretty fun little look.
And you just say, it's an all right look. Yeah, it's okay. And I'm like,
we can just zoom. Zoom in. We can zoom out.
No, that's
always a way to look things a little bit more pleasantly if it comes out a bit wrong. But no, I'm happy with that. I think that's pretty good little image. The resolution's probably okay to print.
How big?
I'd say maybe A3 max on this particular image.
Do you know the resolution of the image? How big it is?
I can see here 5184 by 3456.
There we go.
So yeah, just over 5K. I think it's a 20 megapixel sensor.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Yeah.
Well, that is basically all the time we have for today. Unless you want to do or want to talk about another quick thing, couple of minutes.
I think I've covered most of the little tips and things that I sort of think about when I'm doing winter images.
Nice.
Could maybe just show another image very quickly. I won't run through the edit on here, but here's another example of how winter just gets in the way of things. So obviously there's steam. This is an onsen town in Japan, and as the name suggests, it's just onsen everywhere. There's just steam all over the place. Everyone's having a bath. And when you come through to edit, and I think I worked a lot with the dehazing on here and playing around just to bring out some of the clarity. And I can tell also that this is producing that edit on the smart previews again, because it's via the server. But the print version of this is very clean, and it works very, very well. But yeah, the anything in winter I find takes 5 to 10 times longer. Anything in the snow, you just have to have the patience and the time, because so often you're trying to get images, for example, and you don't want footsteps in the snow, so you have to take the long route round to your viewing point. That takes time.
Oh.
Your fingers are cold.
Yeah.
Your camera battery runs out halfway through your shoot. So another tip actually is putting camera batteries on inside pockets and keeping them warm with your armpits. All sorts of things like that to
keep
you going in.
Take the long walk, unless you want to retouch every one of the footsteps out of the image manually in Photoshop.
Yeah, and I'll leave on one final tip, which is more of a physical well-being one. Have a foot bath at the end, or even midway through. So in the instance of this town, they actually have foot baths all over the town. It's magic. It just regenerates your body. It puts you in the best mood ever. Just warms up your feet. That in turn warms up your whole body, and you can shoot for longer. And yeah, foot baths, magic, absolutely magic. If you see one, socks off, get in.
Very nice. And my personal tip, if you want to play with the dehaze slider, drag it to think where it looks good, where you think it looks good, and then just dial it back a touch, and then it's perfect.
Absolutely.
You mustn't overdo it, because then if you overdo it, it will be like the first days when the clarity slider came out and everybody was just cranking it to 11.
Yeah.
And you always had these so-called HDR photos where it just was clarity all over the place. So in the chat they're saying, nice edit, thanks Tim and Joe. Thank you. Train right next to the houses. Yes. And do cameras react well in the cold? I think we just talked about that. So inside pockets, right? And let me just scroll through, and I must try that. And Joe's images always want me to travel again. And foot bath parlors, dragon for beginners. What? Sorry. Don't know that word.
Not sure.
Perhaps a spelling mistake. Anyway, well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really lovely to see all the transformations of the start to finish images, and in a way that hopefully kept everybody inspired at home. And even if you can't travel, which of course in 2020 is difficult, perhaps you can find some nice shots around you. Something you can take a photo of. For example, I could always take a photo of the sun and try to get that smooth and warm highlight like you just did. Only issue is we don't have snow here. Didn't really snow for the past 3 years, so perhaps I have to paint the grass white. I don't know. Anyway, well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you again. And don't forget, we will be live all week. So make sure to tune in. Let's see if I have the schedule. Yes. Ooh. Look at that, I do have the schedule. Can I pull it up in time? That's the question. Yes, I can. Okay, here we go. Monday, yes, that's the stream we just had. Tomorrow we will be back with the first festive challenge. And you should really tune into that one because there will be some prizes. And one of them might or might not be a Creative Cloud for a year. And some in-person prizes. So who knows? And of course, on Wednesday, festive fresco with Hazel and Rachel. On Thursday, the first fireside chat. So I have to see if I can find some stock image of some fire crackling in the background. And on Friday, my top favorite stream, apart from this one, of course, of the week, it is the Tony and Julia Power Hour with Tony Harmer and Juliet Sieger from Germany. And this would be a fantastic stream. So don't miss any of them. And of course, as always, to close out the stream, let's go back to here. We are always continuing the conversation in Discord. Here is the link. And from all of us over here, thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for having me, Tim. See ya. Bye-bye.